Good morning, everyone. My name is Todd Kimball. I'll be your MC today. It's a pleasure to be joining you on this rainy Sunday, a rare rainy Sunday in June, but we definitely need the rain, so it's good to have it here this morning. A reminder that humanists believe that the ultimate goal should be the fulfillment of the potential for growth in each human personality, not for the favored few, but for all of humankind. And humanists urge the use of reason and compassion to produce the kind of world we want, a world in which peace, prosperity, freedom, and happiness are widely shared. Now, as you guys know, I've been trying to find a way to bring the country together. I've been thinking about different things that we should be focused on to bridge the gap of ideology that we have in this country right now. And I thought back to a book that was popular in my early 20s. Everything I need to know, I learned, or all I really need to know, I learned in kindergarten. And I thought I would read that first poem, which was the theme of the book. Most of what I really need to know about how to live and what to do and how to be, I learned in kindergarten. Wisdom was not at the top of the graduate school mountain, but there in the sand pile at Sunday school. These are the things that I learned. Share everything, play fair, don't hit people, put things back where you found them, clean up your own mess, don't take things that aren't yours, say you're sorry when you hurt somebody, wash your hands before you eat, flush, warm cookies and cold milk are good for you, live a balanced life, learn some and think some, and draw and paint and sing and dance and play and work every day some. Take a nap every afternoon. When you go out into the world, watch for traffic. Hold hands and stick together. Be aware of wonder. Now, I think those are good words to live by, everything except the Sunday school. But we'll give Robert Fulghum a pass on that. I was very excited to meet our guest in the pre-meeting today. She's incredibly passionate, incredibly dynamic, and you guys are really going to enjoy the talk today. Katie Hefner has had a lifelong passion for bees. Her best bee memory occurred in Oregon at age 22 when she saw her first green bee. She is a volunteer for the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation. She joins us today to discuss native bees, their natural history, and tips on how you can provide what they need in small spaces. A warm welcome with lots of muted applause for Katie Hefner.
Okay, let me get my screen shared real quick. Okay, is that looking good?
Looks great.
Yep, okay, here we go. Okay, my name is Katie, and I'm here to talk to you about pollinators, specifically native bees. So hopefully I'll keep on time. Sometimes it's just really exciting and, you know, can't stop talking about it. So, oops. There we go. I am here representing the Xerces Society, which is an invertebrate conservation society. We've been around since 1971, and we work to preserve invertebrates, usually through the conservation of their habitat. So why invertebrates? First of all, what is an invertebrate? An invertebrate is any animal lacking a backbone. So that includes insects, that includes worms and snails, that includes crabs, clams and mussels, a huge diversity of things. And the reason that Xerces focuses in on these is because they provide some really crucial roles in keeping our planet going and turning. One of those things is decomposition. So here we have some sort of dung beetle rolling off a little a little piece to go and decompose, but there are other things like flies and worms that break down organic matter into a form that can be used and recycled. They're also really important for biocontrol, keeping down pest populations. They are the base of the food chain for just about everything. So here we have a bird eating some sort of flying critter. And even if an adult bird species relies mainly on fruits or on seeds, about 96% of terrestrial birds rear their young on insects. So they're pretty important there. And then what we're going to focus in on today is pollination. Sorry, my slides are being sassy. So the way that Xerces works to conserve invertebrates, we have conservation efforts, we have advocacy, so that can be with government authorities, things like that. We also are staffed by primarily scientists. So we have actual biologists on the field doing research, which is really great that we have a science-based approach so that when we make recommendations, we have the research to back it up. And then we also do education, which is what we're doing here. We also have tabling events and things like that. And we are a nonprofit supported largely by members. So I just wanted to say thank you to some of Xerces partners. Real quick, we have partnerships with federal, state, and local agencies, different businesses, different farmers and land managers, and of course our members that are kind of our bread and butter. Okay, so into the fun stuff. I'm gonna do a quick pollination 101. So pollination is the transfer of pollen grains from the stamen of a flower, or the male part of a flower, to the pistil, or the female part of the flower. Some flowers you can do that within the same flower. For some you have to take the pollen of one flower to a different flower of the same species. But this process is necessary for seed formation. And pollination can occur in a multitude of ways. Some plants are pollinated by wind, some by water, but pollinators are doing the bulk of pollination. And pollinators can include things like insects, but also things like birds and even bats. So why should we care about pollinators? One of the, well, probably the biggest reason is that they are responsible for plant reproduction. 85% of flowering plants require a pollinator to produce seeds. So if they aren't receiving pollination, then seeds are not produced and the next generation of plants will not grow. But bringing it a little closer to home, 1 in 3 mouthfuls of food that we consume is the direct result of pollination. So these fruits that their flowers require a pollinator, the fruits won't develop if the flower hasn't been pollinated. So if you've ever gotten like a lopsided apple and you cut it open and you can see that the seeds on one side are not well developed, that flower didn't receive full pollination. So we did a partnership with Whole Foods Market a few years ago to kind of show what would happen if we didn't have pollinators. So this is your normal kind of produce market. This is what's left without pollinators. So obviously there are still food items. Citrus is wind pollinated. Looks like you have some lettuce, some other options. But about 52% of the produce items normally sold at the store were removed. So no apples, avocados, no eggplant, no squash, no tomatoes, no blueberries. Pretty big difference. But thinking about not just ourselves, they support other wildlife. I mentioned the 96% of terrestrial birds require insects for their life cycle. But even things like grizzly bears can eat up to 40,000 moths in one day. So it's not just birds, things like fish, many things rely on either the invertebrate themselves or on the products of pollination, be that fruits or seeds. So let's look at some of the diversity in our pollinators. So we have kind of 6 main groups. Up on starting kind of top left, we have a butterfly, top center is a moth, top right is a fly. This fly is mimicking a bee. You can see its little black and white stripes, trying to convince you not to eat it. Bottom left is a beetle, bottom center is a wasp, and bottom right is a bee. Today we're going to focus in on bees because they are by far the most important pollinator. And there are 3 big reasons for that. One is that bees are the only one of these groups of pollinators that are collecting and transporting pollen intentionally. Bees go to a flower, they collect pollen, they take it back to their nest, and they use it to rear their young. They feed their larvae pollen. Whereas most of the other visitors to flowers are there for the nectar, they're there to find a mate, they're there just happenstantially. Bees are the only visitors that are there for the pollen. Another kind of key behavior with bees is that they have a specific nest that they provide pollination services for the area around. So, butterflies can be migratory, they're just headed on through, but bees are going to stay in a specific location. Bees also exhibit something called flower constancy. So if you're sitting outside in your garden and you see a butterfly coming through, it'll stop at your roses and then your daisies and then your larkspur, and then it'll fly away. If you watch a specific bee, you will see that it travels to the same type of flower again and again and again. It will only visit one specific type of flower on any given foraging trip, which is really important because you need to be matching the pollen with the flower you're trying to pollinate, or pollination won't occur. So this little bumblebee looks like he's headed to a tomato plant, and he will spend, or she will spend her day going from tomato flower to tomato flower. So if I asked you to think of a bee, most people kind of go straight to the honeybee. You see here in this comic, there's like a honeycomb in the background. And that's kind of one of our primary thoughts about bees. And if you ask me to draw a bee, it'll turn out looking kind of like this, big and fluffy, which is more similar to a bumblebee. But there's a really huge diversity in our native bees. And in fact, honeybees are not typical bees at all. I don't know why this man decided to have a bee beard, but with a general native bee, this sort of behavior wouldn't be possible. Basically, they either put a queen bee on his face or the scent of a queen bee on his face, and the colony is following it, and they're just wandering around looking for the queen. But honeybees are social. They have a hierarchy. They have a queen. They have workers. They have drones. And that's not the case for our native bees. Honeybees are non-native. They are European in origin, and they are really important agriculturally for crop pollination. And there are a lot of problems that the beekeeping industry is facing. There's diseases and pests and all kinds of things. But honeybees are not a focus of the Xerces Society, since they are more similar to managed livestock. And we're interested in our wild populations of bees. But if honeybees are a passion of yours, don't worry, because all the things that I'm going to talk about to help our native bees will also be helpful for our honeybees. Okay, so our native bees are solitary. They don't live in a hive. There's just, well, I mean, I guess she is the queen because there's nobody else there to tell her otherwise. But you have a single female who has a nest that she lays her eggs in, that she provides the food for. She seals up the nest. She dies in the fall, and in the spring, her young emerge to start the cycle again. Well, I guess is when she emerges, she mates. Then the males die, and then the female lives her life cycle. Because they don't have a hive that they're protecting, they don't have a stash of honey they're protecting, they don't have a queen they're protecting, they're extremely gentle and unlikely to sting. Some of them can even be held in your hands without any ill effect. I wouldn't try to catch a bee in your hands and see if it's one of the good ones, but they are very hard to provoke because they don't have anything that they're defending. So worldwide, there are about 20,000 species of bees. In the US and Canada, about 3,600. Oregon, maybe 600 to 800. And just Portland proper, maybe 80 to 100. And in a single garden, one of our staff has a small garden in Portland suburb, and he counted 20 to 30 species just in his small garden plot. So our native bees range hugely in size. This big blackhead belongs to a carpenter bee that's about 1.25 inches long, the largest bee in America. And then sitting kind of on top of his eyeball is a tiny little mining bee, which is the smallest known bee in North America. So there's a really huge size diversity. But we also have a really huge color diversity. This is that green metallic sweat bee that I spotted a few years back that really got me interested in all the things that bees could be that I wasn't aware of. So they can range in color from bright metallic, green and blue. They can be very dull. They can have red, orange, white, black, brown, yellow, much more than just the typical black and yellow stripe. Although, of course, many of our bees are black and yellow striped. Our bees also have a pretty wide different ways of carrying their pollen. Honeybees and bumblebees will get some nectar and they'll stick it to the pollen. They'll make a little sticky lump and they'll stick that lump to their hind leg, and then they'll carry it home that way. This bee here, which is a longhorn bee, has these stiff bristles on its hind leg that almost have like feather-like bristles, and they will carry their pollen dry. Some bees have little bristles on their abdomen, and so they'll carry around pollen on their belly. So we have a lot of different strategies for pollen carrying. And then because we have really different sized bees, they're going to be good for different kinds of flowers. Bumblebees have really long tongues and they can pollinate plants that have really deep necks. Or if you have a really little tiny flower, you might need a really tiny little bee. Bumblebees can also do this really cool thing called buzz pollination, which some plants require, things like tomatoes and blueberries, where the pollen is trapped inside and the bee has to grab on, vibrate its wings, and shake it at just the right frequency to get the pollen to come out, which is pretty fun. And then here's just a little infographic that's part of like a little pamphlet that's on our website that you can print out, and it shows some of the different bees in Portland area. So we can see there's sweat bees, there's mason bees, carpenter bees, tickle bees. Tickle bees are some of those ones that won't sting. But that we have a pretty wide variety of bees in our area. And then I do want to point out one thing that is not a bee. When I was doing tabling events and things like that, we would hear all the time, like, what do I do about those terrible bees? They're ruining my picnic. I can't eat in my backyard anymore because of all the bees. And what they're experiencing is probably wasps, in fact, because wasps are carnivorous. They are interested in the turkey from your Subway sandwich, whereas bees are vegetarian. They eat pollen and nectar. So if you're being harassed while you're trying to eat outside, it's probably because of a wasp. And wasps do provide a lot of really great services, especially if you're like a gardener. They do a lot of pest management, things like that. But they can be aggressive. They are guarding a nest and a queen and young, and they're predators. So that can be somewhat of a problem. Okay, here we go. Okay, so let's look at the natural history of our native bees a little bit. So I mentioned that they are solitary, but bees actually have the exact same life cycle as a butterfly, but we don't see it, so a lot of people don't know about it. Up in the top center, we have a picture of a mining bee. She has emerged, she's gathering pollen, and she's gonna make a little loaf of bee bread or a little bee cake of pollen, and she's going to deposit it in her nest. After she's made her little loaf, she's going to lay an egg on it. That egg will hatch into a little larva. The larva will eat the cake, it will grow, and then once it's eaten all the cake and grown big and strong, it will pupate, just like caterpillars form cocoons. The pupa will do the same thing, and it will turn into an adult bee and emerge the next year. So what we just saw was a mining bee. Mining bees are ground nesters, as are 70% of our native bees. Here are a couple pictures of what their nests kind of look like. They'll dig down underground, they'll build little tunnels, they'll lay eggs in these little brood cells, and then kind of seal them up as the year goes on. They can resemble ants' nests from above ground, but if you don't see any ants crawling out of it, probably belongs to some bees. And so they need access to soil to be able to dig these nests. Roughly the other 30% of our native bees are tunnel nesting. And unlike our mining bees, they don't make the tunnels themselves. They are relying on finding an appropriate tunnel. So things like dead trees and snags will have cavities and holes, either from beetles or from birds, that they can build their nests in. They'll also use like the hollow stems of a plant, things like that. But they'll make their nests starting at the back and kind of moving forward in that little tunnel. And then bees also need some nest materials. This picture is of a leaf cutter bee. And so she goes out and she cuts a little perfect circle out of the leaf and she brings it back to her nest, and she uses it to kind of create a wall between her different eggs. Some bees collect resin for building materials, some collect soil, but there's kind of a wide variety of materials that they use to build nests. And then I want to talk a little bit about bumblebees, because their life cycle is a little different. Bumblebees are social. They're one of our few social native bees. They have a queen, they have workers, they have drones. So essentially, a queen emerges in the spring. She spent the winter hibernating. She emerges in the spring. She picks out a spot for a nest. Again, she's not a good digger. She needs to find a spot that is already suitable. So she'll look for an empty rodent nest or a place of like tumbled down grass or leaves that she can kind of hang out underneath. And she'll begin to lay eggs, and she's collecting all the pollen to get kind of the first few workers hatched. Once the workers are hatched, they're going out, they're collecting pollen, and the size of the colony is growing. In the fall, some of those eggs that are hatching develop into next season's queens and to males. So the new queen mates, and then she spends the fall looking for a good spot to hibernate for the winter, and the cycle starts again. The honeybee colonies are annual. Honeybee colonies are perennial. They'll last multiple years, but each bumblebee nest only lasts 1 year. So like I said, they're not good diggers. They need kind of an existing place to move into, and so they'll often have be moving into overgrown places where there's kind of a spot that they can that they can make homey without too much excavation. And then all bees need flowers. Habitat, flowering habitat is really important for all kinds of bees. They drink the nectar for energy, and then of course they're collecting the pollen. So let's look at a few threats that our native bees are facing. So big one is habitat loss, and that can be in the form of development, that can be in the form of agriculture, or just landscaping even that's not pollinator friendly, or it can also be contaminating an area with pesticides so that it's unusable. And habitat loss can even look innocuous. Areas that are really highly manicured, either with bark chips or mulch, or this really pristine lawn. These are essentially sterile environments. They are not good habitat for either nesting or for foraging. So they're kind of wasted space almost. And then pesticides are also a threat. And I want to highlight an incident that happened just down the road in Wilsonville a few years ago, where there were some linden trees that were blooming, and they were covered in aphids, and the aphids were dropping excretions onto the cars below. Of course, that's unacceptable. So you call out, the pest control, and they sprayed the trees, and they sprayed them according to all of the correct instructions. They followed all the appropriate laws. But because they sprayed the trees in bloom and there were bees visiting those trees, there was a die-off of 50,000 bumblebees in just 2 weeks. So that just kind of goes to show that even if you're following the directions and you're doing everything correctly, that there can still be some pretty serious consequences for our native bees, because most pesticides, when they are approved, they aren't taking native bees and their biology into account. But the good news is that in Wilsonville, you can no longer spray that pesticide on linden trees. And the pesticides are also heavily used for cosmetic reasons. Agriculture is a little bit of a different story. There's more on the line than just crops looking good. But pesticide use for strictly cosmetic reasons can kind of render what would be useful habitat non-useful. And then, of course, climate change is a factor in kind of changing where bees can live and what flowers are surviving, and some bees have certain relationships with certain native plants, and so that's kind of a factor that's at play. But let's talk about some things that we can do to help, because there are so many easy ways that we can contribute. But I do want to make a note that beekeeping does not equal bee conservation. There are tons of good reasons to keep honeybees. You want honey, you have an orchard, you want pollinated, something like that. But bee conservation isn't one of them. Honeybees are a livestock, so it would be kind of equivalent to wanting to do bird conservation and then rearing chickens. It's not exactly related. But that being said, there are reasons to beekeep. So one of the biggest things is providing habitat for their entire life cycle. They need nest sites, they need flowers, they need safe environments that are pesticide free. And so here is an example of some partial habitats. So bees don't need large areas, and the good news is that they are mobile. They can fly. So maybe they're nesting in a dead tree, but they can fly over to a copse and forage there. So here's kind of a bee's eye view of a neighborhood. So maybe at one house, there's a really good nesting location, they set up there, and then they can fly down the street to a really great forage site. And then, when spring's over, that foraging site is not in bloom anymore, but they can fly over to another yard to get some summer flowers. So one of the things that, if you're interested in having some bee habitat, but you don't have a lot of space or something like that, you can see what's around you. You can see what partial habitats are available in your area and try and fill in some of those gaps. So there are partial habitats in lots of places. There's bioswales, there's power line passes, there's local parks, there's roadsides will often have flowers. So sometimes it's just a matter of going for a walk in your neighborhood and seeing what's available, and then trying to fill in some habitat gaps. So they also need nest sites. So retaining snags and dead trees, they seem kind of like an eyesore, but they provide tons of habitat and resources for more than just bees. But they are a really good resource. Having some bare ground, not being afraid of that. So shrubs with hollow stems, sometimes that just means when winter comes, not chopping everything down to ground level, leaving some of those stems available so that someone can use them for a nest. Or even, so this picture is of an area between a rocky wall and a driveway. It's about 8 to 10 inches wide, but underneath that rock, there's 3 little holes that lead down to bee nests. It doesn't have to be a large area at all. They just need some amount of bare ground. And then if you're feeling really ambitious, you can make a nest block. Mason bees are kind of coming in vogue right now. They are cavity nesters, and people will actually go out and buy mason bees and bring them to their yard. That's not really necessary. If you have the habitat available, they'll find you. And there's lots of instructions kind of on our website or on the internet in general on how to build one of these. But a couple things I do want to point out is that they need to be deep enough. The holes do, because so the mother bee will start at the back and she'll lay female eggs, and then as she starts getting closer to the front, she starts to lay males. And so the males will hatch out in the spring. And the reason for that is if there's a predator or a pest or something that's coming in to the tunnel, the males are the ones that are going to get eaten and not the females, because with no females, there's no continued population. So if the nests are too short, then you'll have a higher population of males, which doesn't really help. And then also the blocks or the nests need to be cleaned out every season to prevent the spread of disease. But here is a picture of a little mason bee filling up the nest with some mud. So you can see these are all full nest blocks. And then you could be helping more than just bees. This piece of grass sticking out of that nest block is from a solitary wasp. But like solitary bees, solitary wasps are very gentle. They're not protecting a hive, so they will just kind of eat the pests out of your yard and leave everything else be. So besides nesting sites, having foraging patches can be really helpful. Of course, native plants are the best if they're available to you, and then having flowers that bloom kind of throughout the year. So having if you have a diversity of plants available, then it's easier to have some that bloom in spring, some in summer, some in fall, and are kind of providing a food source throughout the year. As far as color goes, bees can't see the color red. Obviously, this is a bee on a red flower, so that works out well, telling you not to buy red flowers. They see ultraviolet really well, though, which we can't see to know which they're attracted to. But when it comes to choosing plants, you go to the nursery and you see which plants have bees on them. And those are the ones that bees like. Having native species is great because they are naturally more drought tolerant, and they survive better than non-native plants do. And then, so landscape context is what I talked about with looking at the habitat around you. If you notice that nothing blooms in your area in July, then if you have room for just a couple plants, picking something that blooms in July could fill that need. So here are some examples of some native plants that kind of have a variety of blooming seasons. On the left, we have golden currant and flowering willows. Kind of in the middle, we have lupin and hardhack. Middle right, we have pearly everlasting native thistle. Those are kind of summer plants, late summer. And then you kind of get into like the asters, anything in the sunflower family is great. And the kind of bottom right are, it's a plant called beggar's tick. It's a really great fall plant. But having a variety of options will create great habitat. So there are some plants that are not native that, it's okay to use them. Like if you just love lavender, like it's fine. You can totally have lavender. Bees love lavender. But you just want to choose them carefully. And if you can't get, Oregon native, getting a plant native to North America would be better than getting a plant native to Europe. But yeah, if you have like a sufficient variety, like there's no reason not to use plants that you just love because they're beautiful. There is the cultivar conundrum, where plants have been kind of bred so much that they have lost their ability to produce pollen and nectar at all. So these marigolds are pretty but useless for pollinators. So again, when you're visiting a nursery, saying which plants have bees if your goal is to attract bees. And then maybe you don't want to garden. Gardening is not your thing. Even just applying benign neglect to your lawn can provide resources for pollinators. Clover is a fantastic pollinator flower, and it's one of the first things to bloom in the spring. So when the bees are emerging, if you can just, give that first mow of the spring a few weeks, let the bees forage on those clover till other plants start to bloom, and then you can mow, it's fine. But it's a great excuse to be just a little bit lazy, right? And then if at all possible, we recommend avoiding using pesticides. And if you have to use them, minimize them. And especially don't use them if you see a bee on the plant. But there are lots of pesticides that can persist in the plant that kind of make their way into the pollen and the nectar, and they're called systemic pesticides. So even if you're not using pesticides yourself, you want to check with the nursery that you're buying plants from and see if they've been treated with pesticides, especially insecticides such as neonicotinoids. They can remain in a plant for months or years. They make their way into the pollen, so the bee consumes the pollen, and usually it will have sublethal effects. So they won't, just be littering the ground of the nursery dead, but they will be unable to. Often they get like disoriented and confused. They can't find their way back to their nest or something like that, that it ends up being just as bad. But when you go to a nursery, just ask like, hey, what have these plants been treated with? If they don't know, you probably should shop somewhere else, because they should be aware of what's in their plants. And if you're really interested in kind of the pesticide thing, we have entire webinars on pesticides on our YouTube channel. And then there are, of course, pesticide alternatives. And if you have a diverse variety of plants, that will also prevent some of the pest problems that occur. So if you have kind of these pollinator areas where you're not mowing your lawn every single week to provide a little bit of foraging space. We have these cool signs that say pollinator habitat, because when you stick a sign in your yard, people are like, oh, okay. And they're not just angry at you. You can also totally make your own sign. Our signs aren't magic or anything, but it kind of just creates it creates an education opportunity, and it keeps the HOA off your back. I don't know. But we have this Bring Back the Pollinator pledge, basically, that you can do. And then if you want to buy the sign, you can. You certainly don't have to. But it's basically just a commitment to grow pollinator-friendly plants, provide nest and egg laying sites, avoid use pesticides, and then share the word. So that's bringbackthepollinators.org. Another really cool initiative we have is Bee City USA. And so that is kind of communicating with different cities who want to commit to being bee friendly, and so educating them on how to create great habitat, how to reduce pesticide use, how to do outreach. And we have quite a few bee cities in Oregon. Portland isn't one of them, but Wilsonville is, Westland, Eugene. There are several cities, but it's kind of a really great way to make a difference for pollinators. We also have some really interesting community science initiatives. So you can see here, this person's taking a picture of a bumblebee. We have this app called Bumblebee Watch, where you're out on a walk, you see a bumblebee, you're like, oh, cool, let me take a picture. You upload it to the app, and then the app has like some different like pictures and things to help you roughly identify what kind of bumblebee it is. You don't even have to identify it. You can just throw the picture up there and an expert will identify it. But it gives scientists an idea for which bumblebee species are in which areas, which can be really helpful for scientists. And then if you do that and you love it and you're obsessed and you just want to go like even harder, there's the Pacific Northwest Bumblebee Atlas, which is, you're conducting a formal bumblebee survey. Whole Pacific Northwest is like split up into grid cells. You adopt a grid cell, you go out with a net and you catch bees for 45 minutes and you chill them in a cooler and you take pictures, and it's really intense, but I've done it for a few years and it's super fun. But there's like 20 different species of bumblebees in the region. So it can be pretty fun. Nebraska Bumblebee Atlas obviously is in Nebraska, but there's a similar program over there. And then there's the Western Monarch Milkweed Mapper, which we don't have monarchs typically like directly in Portland, Willamette Valley area, but if you're a little bit further out, that might be something for you. We also have lots of books and publications that have plant ideas and all kinds of great things. We also have tons of downloads on our website at xerces.org, and they're all free. There's fact sheets, there's brochures, there's native plant lists, there are information on pesticides, and they're all free. It's a really great resource. I think there's also a place that can help you find a native nursery that grows their plants without pesticides. So a lot of resources up there. We also have a YouTube channel where we post a lot of our other webinars and education things. We are on social media at Xerces Society. And then again, we are a donor member-based society. So if you wanted to become a member, you can go to xerces.org/donate. And thank you all very much for your time. Anybody have any questions?
Oh, we'll have lots of questions. Thank you. Thank you so much, Katie. That was a wonderful presentation. Very informative. I love your pictures and your infographics. And I love how you took us across the spectrum of the really involved, dedicated pollinator habitat people to the benign neglect. Some of us might fall in that benign neglect category.
I am a benign neglect myself.
I have a question.
Okay, Liz, go ahead with your question.
Okay, thanks. This might be a kind of a dumb question, but I have leaves still in my yard from my tree in the fall, and I've been cleaning them up. Should I leave? I mean, is anything helpful about dead leaves?
Yeah. So dead leaves can be extremely helpful. Even like butterflies will overwinter in dead leaves, or they'll be pupating in dead leaves. What I do in my yard is I just kind of rake them up into a pile and leave the pile.
Okay.
That way, if there were any cocoons or anything in there, that they're kind of safe. I think it could also be a good possible nesting location for something like a bumblebee, if you're interested. So you certainly don't have to keep all your leaves, but there are helpful things that can be done with them.
Okay, thanks. My other question is, do you all use volunteers at your society?
Yes, I am a volunteer myself. We do have a volunteer program, and I think there is more information on the website about that if you're interested.
Okay, thanks. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz. Our next two questions come from Helen's. Our first Helen to chime in with a question was Helen Christians. Helen, go ahead with your question.
Hi. I just experience I had, and I was hoping you could help me figure it out. I have a flower garden that's usually covered with bees, and I can weed in there and be in there, and they don't give me any trouble. I've had it for years.
Mm-hmm.
Spring, I heard these bees kind of started coming around my head, but I've been with them for so many years that I didn't get afraid. And the tone of their that sound that they make with their wings escalated, but I still, like a fool, didn't get scared because I've been with the bees for years. I talked to them, and well, anyway, I should have gotten scared because I got stung multiple times.
Mm-hmm.
And I was fine. I mean, it hurt, but did some different kind of bees get into my garden? It's a square of about maybe 15 feet by 8 feet.
Were they big bumblebees?
No. They weren't wasps, though. I know the difference. And
okay.
Yeah.
That's
but
interesting.
I was surprised, and I've been back weeding there, and they haven't given me any trouble. But I was using a tool like a little hoe to weed pretty aggressively, and I was thinking maybe there was a nest in the dirt.
Yes. Well, I ran across that problem once, or my mother did weeding my garden for me, where she was pulling weeds and she ended up too close to a bumblebee nest, and she got stung because she was pulling up the nest essentially, and she wasn't aware. So there's a possibility that there was a nest close by. I know there are certain bees, like the horned bumblebees, will get a little territorial. They'll actually like come up and headbutt you when you're closer to their their territory than they want you to be. But usually they don't sting. Usually they're just kind of a big show. It's interesting that it was multiple bees though, because like I said, most of our native bees are solitary. So I guess there's a chance that there was like a wild honeybee population.
They weren't real big, and they were warning me. I mean, their sound told me get away, but I've been there for so many years. I thought, well, they can't be talking to me. Well, they were. So I've picked up on that. Okay, it was unusual then.
I would think so, from what it sounds like.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Helen trying to be the Timothy Treadwell of bees there for a bit, but we're glad that worked out okay. Worked better for you than the grizzly man there. Our next question comes from Helen Osts. Helen.
Okay, I actually have two questions. The first one is, when I was at Save Island a while back and picking peaches, and I asked them about bees, and they said they did not bring in bees. They actually were encouraging native bees. I was surprised because I thought an orchard would require them to bring in bees. Are you familiar with that, or do you know of other places that do that?
Yeah, so I know that in some situations, or maybe you have, just peaches, and you don't have any other plants around. I feel like Sauvie Island has some other, like the pumpkin patch, and they have some other sources that are blooming at different seasons. But if they have, crops that are blooming in different seasons, that potentially the native pollinators can be surviving based on that. Sometimes farmers will have, I'm just forgetting the name of what it's called, but on the edges of their land, they'll have some specific pollinator habitat that they're planting, little bushes or wildflowers or something, specifically to provide forage in those seasons when their orchard isn't blooming. And doing that kind of keeps the native bees around. They can live their whole life cycle in that area, so they do.
Okay, thank you. I have a second question.
Sorry, I just saw in the chat the name I was looking for.
Okay, I have a second question, and that, bear with me, I'm trying to think of how to state it. I know that when you're dealing with some caterpillars or insects, they have specific plants, only ones that they go to. Do our native bees, do they have specific native plants that they have to go to or not?
I would say that there are definitely some plants that they favor. I would say the problem is probably more for the plants than for the bee. So yes, like, the monarch butterfly, they need milkweed. They only use milkweed. But for bees, they need to be a little more flexible because they're kind of around for the whole growing season. So they need to be able to forage from multiple plants, but there probably are specific plants that require a certain pollinator. And without that pollinator, that plant can't finish its life cycle. So I don't have any super specific examples of that, but I don't think it's like you need to plant this plant to save this bee. I don't think we have that I know of. I don't think we have any of those particular problems that we're aware of.
Thank you.
Now, in our green room pre-meeting, a few minutes before the official meeting started, Joyce Lackey had a number of great questions, and she's going to ask one of those now.
So here you go. We chatted, you mentioned climate change in your talk, and what you mentioned also earlier that a problem for bees may happen when the flowers do not bloom at the same time that the bees emerge from their nests, and therefore those bees may die off. But you suggested there may be some ways to deal with that, and I don't know what they are.
Yes, I think I think that's kind of where planting a diversity of plants kind of comes in, that if you have one plant that's either sensitive to the temperature or the rainfall, that it's kind of finicky about when it begins to bloom, having some plants that are maybe a little less finicky, that only care about the hours of sunlight, and that's their only cue. So if you have a diversity of plants, I think that there's a better chance that you're not going to miss that early spring window. And then clover, like I mentioned, is a great early spring. One of the first things that comes up is a great resource. As far as like preventing it as a whole from happening, there's not really much that we can do other than hope that they that the cycles get adjusted.
Well, and you did just say that some people in agriculture plant little strips, so that might be of flowers that would bloom longer, which might be another answer.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Now, Willie typed a question in the chat, which I'll read. What do you think of the practice of washing mason bee eggs and cleaning their tubes?
I personally don't have a super specific opinion on it. I know tons of people do it. And so I'm sure that there are ways to do it, appropriately. I know people who keep the kind of the cocoons like in their refrigerator over winter so that they don't freeze, and then they are kind of in control over when they emerge, so that they don't emerge too early, I guess. I don't know. I'm kind of the person who figures that nature's got it figured out. And
about 20, 25 years ago, mason bees were real popular. And at that time, they just had us take a block of wood, drill holes in it, and stick it up on the south side. And we still have those blocks. We brought them from another house with us, and the bees still love them. We never heard about washing their nests out and to keep bugs, bad bugs away or anything. And now we've done the modern thing with buying all these fancy houses with the tubes in them. And I think our bees still like the planks better than they like the fancy new things. So
yeah, so I mean,
we've never washed them once.
Yeah, it's the washing's just been recommended because of like certain fungal diseases that are kind of going around, you know. So if the bee last season had the fungus, and the bee making the nest this season, you know, can get the fungus. So washing is like, it's recommended. And as far as like, well, sometimes you don't even have to wash them. If you have just like solid wood, you can just bore out the hole again, slightly larger.
What time of year? I'm always afraid that I'm boring out eggs.
Oh, right. That's a good question. Yeah, I haven't done it personally, and I'm sure there's some information on our website, but I would say after, when you see that the holes are open, when you've seen that the bees have left. And I think that's why people do.
Once they leave, though, they come back and start laying eggs.
So they don't start laying eggs immediately. They have to mate. They have to start kind of collecting resources. So it's, I mean, you've got a couple weeks, I would think. And even if you bore out kind of that very first egg that they laid, like, I don't know. I feel like that's better than getting mites or fungus. But I'm sure there is some info. I think we do actually have some mason bee information on our website.
I'll look that up.
But yeah, I think that one of the reasons that people do take out the cocoons and wash them is so that they're in control of when they can wash it, you know?
Oh.
I've also seen people use like paper straws to line.
My bees won't touch them.
They don't like them.
I've even tried to make my own straws out of special kind of paper.
Yeah, okay.
They hate that. They like bamboo better.
Well, I think that's probably the more natural option.
Now, Dave had a question in chat, which I will read. When a bee stings you, is it fatal for the bee?
That's a good question. Certainly for certain species of bees, for honeybees, it is. For bumblebees, it's not. And as far as like really specific native bees, I think it's a mix, honestly. I think that, you know, honeybees are somewhat more disposable in their, you know, like you have so many workers. If you lose a few defending the hive, like that's okay. Whereas if our solitary bees, if, you know, the only bee of her hive stings you and dies, then her nest is finished. She doesn't get to finish her life cycle and, you know, create progeny. So I from what I'm remembering, I think that a great number of native bees don't die when they sting, but I'd imagine some of them still do.
Del Allen had a question. Does the Xerces Society welcome or encourage visitors in any way?
To our downtown office, not really. They aren't even letting staff in there for the most part. It's been tricky to get in myself. But hopefully in the not too distant future, we'll be doing events again. We often have a presence at, like we've been to the Oregon Zoo several times and lots of places where there are people present and giving presentations or doing tabling and answering questions. And any place that we're out and about in public, we welcome everyone. But as far as the office itself right now is essentially closed.
Yeah. So I'll ask a question as I wait for other questions to come in. I really appreciate this presentation today to let us know what we can do to help the bee population. And it seems like more and more people are starting to understand just how critical bees are to our ecosystem, but still seems like there would be major lobbying groups like in the land development and real estate industries where they have other objectives. Are some of these competing interests starting to sit down and like make compromises to help the bee population, or what would you say about that?
Yeah, I mean, that's not my field of expertise. I know that we recently got the first bee listed on the endangered species list, the rusty patch bumblebee. So that I know that that was a big success, getting that recognized. But I mean, as far as like land management and things go, like with agriculture, we have, you know, a lot in common, a lot of common ground. Like you want your plants pollinated. We want your plants pollinated. Here's some ways to do it without you having to ship honeybees across the country. So I feel like there is a lot of common ground there. I think that pesticides is really where some of the harder conversations are. Because, you know, as a farmer, like you want to protect your livelihood and you want, you know, you want your crop to be successful, and, you know, pesticides increase that possibility, but then it also is a problem for pollinators, and you need your plants pollinated, and, you know, kind of goes back and forth. But yeah, I know we have staff that are, their entire job is to work with land managers and with farmers to kind of solve some of these problems.
Sounds good. And I know earlier Gretchen wrote a very good question that I was reading, and somehow it disappeared off my screen and I can't remember it. Gretchen, can I get you to come on and ask your question?
Yes, I have a couple of yellow swallowtails that are dallying about my yard. I have a number of rhododendrons and the peonies, but I see them, and then I'm wondering, are they migratory? Is there any way, if they stay in the area, to enable them to propagate? I let the lawn go a little bit and have quite a bit of clover. So, you know, what can I do to help these guys? They're beautiful.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know what specific, if there's any specific plants that the caterpillars prefer for swallowtails. They are beautiful. I'm not 100% sure if they're migratory or not. I feel like most butterflies tend to wander a good bit. But I can Google it real quick if you're very interested.
That sounds good.
I can Google too. Thank you.
Okay.
And so it looks like, I'm not sure if these two were answered or if she has a third question, but it looks like Helen Ost may have a third question for you, Katie. Did you have another mason bee question, Helen?
She's on mute.
She is.
Helen, you're on mute.
There we go. Okay.
Okay. The reason we started with mason bees was that our early blooming pear tree just didn't have any insects at all at that time. And we ourselves have had very favorable success using the paper tubes. And we put out this last year, you know, 20 mason bees. And when we cleaned them and got them, we got 300, which we then gave to other people. I'm not sure, now that you're talking about it, how wonderful it is for the native bees if they come by themselves, but it certainly was helpful for us.
Yeah, I know tons of people, you know, are really excited about it, and, you know, if you can buy the bee, you guaranteed, you know, you've got the bees. It's great. And I mean, we encourage attracting native ones, just because if you know, the mason bees are being shipped from somewhere else and there's like a local disease or pest problem that's being kind of, you know, shipped to your area, and then the native mason bees are kind of getting the whatever it is from, you know, the ones that were shipped from wherever else, is kind of the thought process. But I mean, if you have extra extra bees, you know, sharing those with people kind of in your general area, I think is great. I wouldn't mail them across the country or, you know, across state lines, but giving them to your friends that are local, I think is probably fine.
Okay, more questions are coming in. We have a question from our current president and technical director, David DiNucci.
Thanks. It's actually maybe sort of a tangent, and don't spend too much time on it because I see other good questions. But I noticed in your talk, you talk about, well, in this kind of a case, there's more males born than females. And you mentioned another place where, you know, a new queen is kind of chosen from the batch or whatever. So it seems like there's lots of this selection, sexual selection and queen selection that's happening intentionally, sort of. What's the mechanism for that?
Yeah, I can't speak to the specific mechanism, but when the season's kind of getting on, I'm going to focus on kind of bumblebees. In the early season, the queen is laying eggs that will only develop into worker females. But as it's getting later into the season, she's receiving whatever environmental triggers that say time for some different eggs. And so the new queens for the next season, it is like a specific, they are queen eggs. It's not workers who are like the biggest and the best and deemed queen worthy. There are specific queen eggs, and then when the queen eggs are being laid, the male eggs are also being laid, so that they're hatching at the same time and free to mate. Although often I think they'll seek out males from a different colony for some of that genetic mix up there, because when you just have the one queen, she's laying kind of consistent progeny. But yeah, it is pretty interesting that kind of they have like this really fancy like mating dance up in the air and picking their mates, and I think the queens actually might mate with more than one female. But yeah, after mating is complete, the males just kind of go and die. They never return back to the hive or anything. Their mission is complete.
That sounds good. I'll read a question from Susan Pierce. Are giant Asian hornets a potential threat to Oregon bees in general, specifically to honeybees? Do we need to be concerned or vigilant about this? I
think I feel like my gut response is no, because people, I think people have tried to be vigilant about it, and they've been killing a lot of our native hornets that are not the invasive one, because it's big, so it's got to be, you know, the Asian, you know, one. So I think a lot of really well-intentioned people have not, just been, you know, killing a lot of things that weren't the right thing to kill. I mean, if you can positively identify one, I think it's good to remove it from the population, but I don't think it's something that scientists are panicking about per se. It is what it is. Invasive species are invading all the time, and it's hard to control. I don't know if there's like a spot to report sightings. That might be worth a Google. But if you see one reporting it, I know that we had a bumblebee species that's native to the East Coast that people brought over for use in a greenhouse, and then that escaped. And so now we have like an invasive bumblebee species that people have been reporting sightings of, and they're trying to kind of quell those colonies if possible. But yeah, I don't think it's anything to get super duper worried about.
Joyce Lackey has another question.
Joyce, you're on mute.
I just took it off. Thank you. I know that the Xerces Society is concerned mostly with native bees. And I think you told me that the bees that are being trucked all across various state lines are non-native species. Does Xerces have any influence at all in lessening that trucking industry, that huge farming industry to get bees moved?
Yeah. I think we really we don't really put much of any attention on honeybees. So I think we agree that it's a bad idea. And if anybody asks us if it's a good idea, we'll say no. But as far as like working with legislators or with any kind of rulemaking authority, I think that our focuses are elsewhere.
Thank you.
I'll ask a second question while we wait for any final questions. I was impressed by the flight path of bees. You said they could nest in one place and pollinate in many other places. What's the typical or the healthy radius that a bee can travel?
Yeah, that's a great question. It varies hugely by species, but a mile easily, maybe 5.
Wow.
I think there's some species that like have been reported like 20 miles away from where they were spotted, although I don't know if they were there on purpose or not. But yeah, like kind of a 5-mile radius is certainly feasible for a lot of species.
Well, Katie, this was fun and informative, and I think you really inspired some bee activism here today. So thank you.
Very glad.